Over the sound of echoing footsteps in a concrete corridor, the camera sweeps past rows of solid steel doors. A narrator's voice cuts through. Deep inside California's Pelican Bay State Prison, men lived for decades in windowless cells, locked alone for 22 to 24 hours a day. In 2015, a lawsuit cracked that system open and changed the future of solitary confinement across the state. Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989 as California's flagship supermax, with a security housing unit, SHU, designed for near-total isolation. Cells measured roughly 8 by 10 feet, no windows, no phone calls, no contact visits. Prisoners spent years, sometimes decades, in these conditions. California officials justified it as a way to control gang violence, but by the mid-2000s, civil rights lawyers were receiving thousands of letters describing mental collapse, sensory deprivation, and suicides linked to SHU conditions. By 2011, California held about 3,000 people in its SHUs, and more than 1,100 had been there for over 10 years. At Pelican Bay alone, hundreds of men were locked down on the basis of gang validation, a process that often relied on secret informants, old photographs, or possession of certain artwork. Prisoners were told they could leave the SHU if they debriefed, that is, gave information about other gang members, but for many, that meant risking their lives or betraying friends. In practice, isolation was indefinite. Two long-term prisoners, Todd Ashker and Danny Troxell, decided to fight back. With help from outside advocates and the Center for Constitutional Rights, CCR, they filed a class action lawsuit in 2012. Ashker v. Brown, later Ashker v. Newsom after the change in governor. They argued that indefinite solitary confinement violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment and the 14th Amendment's guarantee of due process. Now, unlike earlier lawsuits that challenged individual placements, this case attacked the system itself, Pelican Bay's entire SHU policy. At the same time, prisoners inside staged two massive hunger strikes in 2011 and 2013. At the peak of the 2013 strike, nearly 30,000 California inmates refused meals in solidarity. The strikes drew national headlines, hearings before the California Assembly's Public Safety Committee, and statements from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, who called long-term solitary cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The combination of legal pressure and public outrage forced California to the negotiating table. In June 2015, just weeks before trial, the state agreed to a landmark settlement. Under the deal, California promised to end indefinite solitary confinement based solely on gang association, cap the length of time a person can remain in the SHU, create a 2-year step-down program with programming and reviews for those who pose real safety threats, transfer thousands of prisoners from the SHU to general population or other less restrictive housing. When U.S. District Judge Claudia Wilkin approved the settlement that September, it became one of the most sweeping solitary confinement reforms in U.S. history. By early 2016, more than 1,500 men had been moved out of Pelican Bay's SHU. For some, it was their first touch of sunlight on a prison yard in 20 years. This chapter sets the stage for what follows: how a single lawsuit, born from the darkest cells in California, reshaped policy not only at Pelican Bay, but across the state's entire correctional system. In the next chapters, we'll go inside those cells, meet the people who lived through them, and trace how the settlement's promises collided with the reality of prison life. At Pelican Bay's security housing unit, daily life was stripped down to the barest essentials. Each prisoner spent nearly every hour locked in a cell that was smaller than a parking space. The doors were solid steel with a slot for passing food trays or handcuffing during escorts. There were no windows to the outside, only fluorescent lighting that cycled between harsh brightness and artificial dimness. The silence was broken only by the occasional clang of doors or distant shouts muffled through thick walls. Inside, there was a concrete bed frame, a thin mattress, a toilet sink unit, and little else. Meals arrived on plastic trays pushed through the slot, lukewarm, bland, and predictable. Recreation was limited to 90 minutes a day, alone, in what prisoners called a dog run, a small concrete-walled pen with a patch of sky above. For many, this was the only direct contact with sunlight. The psychological toll was staggering. Letters from SHU prisoners described hallucinations, panic attacks, and a sense of living in a coffin. Some men paced endlessly, wearing paths into the concrete floor. Others withdrew into themselves, staring at the walls for hours, their speech reduced to whispers or mutters. Suicides and self-harm attempts were common. Prison psychiatrists documented conditions like severe depression, anxiety disorders, and psychosis, but access to mental health care was minimal. Treatment often meant heavy doses of medication rather than meaningful therapy. Indefinite confinement made the despair worse. Unlike prisons where solitary is imposed for a fixed term, Pelican Bay's SHU terms could last decades. The only way out was to debrief by providing information about gangs. But debriefing carried heavy risks: retaliation from other prisoners, permanent labeling as a snitch, and sometimes false accusations extracted under pressure. Many prisoners calls it a no-win choice: either betray others or remain buried alive. This system didn't just punish violent acts, it punished association. Possessing certain artwork, reading materials, or tattoos could be used as validation of gang membership. A drawing of an Aztec warrior, for instance, might be cited as proof of Mexican mafia ties. A simple handshake seen by an officer could be noted as gang activity. Once validated, a man could remain in isolation indefinitely, without a meaningful chance to challenge the evidence. By the late 2000s, statistics revealed just how entrenched the problem was. Over 500 Pelican Bay prisoners had been in solitary for more than a decade. Some had been isolated for over 20 years. Human rights groups began comparing California's practices to torture, citing international standards that define solitary beyond 15 days as inhumane. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, warned that long-term solitary confinement could cause permanent psychological damage and even violate international law. Yet California officials defended the system as essential for controlling gang violence. They argued that prison gangs were highly organized, capable of orchestrating assaults and murders even from behind bars. The SHU, they claimed, was the only tool strong enough to sever those communication lines. But the evidence presented by advocates painted a darker reality. Many men in the SHU were not active gang members at all. Some were there simply because they refused to inform, or because of flimsy evidence never tested in court. This grim reality set the stage for the Ashker lawsuit. It wasn't only about conditions, it was about constitutionality. Was it lawful to hold a person in near total isolation for decades, without meaningful review, based on secret evidence? Could the state justify the mental devastation that came with such confinement by pointing to the specter of prison gangs? The lawsuit aimed to put those questions front and center before a federal judge. For the men inside, the stakes were life and death. In their letters, they described themselves as buried alive or entombed in concrete. Some clung to hope that the lawsuit might finally pierce the walls around them. Others doubted anything could change. After all, Pelican Bay's SHU had been operating for over 20 years without serious reform. But by organizing hunger strikes, writing declarations, and putting their names on the case, prisoners signaled that they were ready to challenge one of the most entrenched practices in American corrections. In the summer of 2011, something unprecedented happened inside California's prisons. From the isolation cells of Pelican Bay's SHU, a group of men decided they would no longer accept their conditions in silence. They had been locked away for decades, without contact visits, without sunlight, without an end date. If the courts and politicians would not listen, they would speak through the only weapon left to them: their bodies. On July 1st, 2011, nearly 1,000 men at Pelican Bay began refusing food. Within days, the protest spread like wildfire across the state. Reports from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, confirmed that more than 6,600 prisoners in at least a dozen facilities joined the strike at its height. It was one of the largest coordinated hunger strikes in U.S. prison history. The prisoners issued a 5-point demand list that was circulated in letters smuggled to the outside world. End group punishment and administrative abuse. Stop punishing entire racial groups for individual actions. Abolish the debriefing policy. No more coercing prisoners to inform in exchange for release from solitary. End long-term solitary confinement. Replace indefinite isolation with meaningful, fixed terms. Provide adequate and nutritious food. Expand constructive programming. Access to educational, vocational, and self-help opportunities. The list was striking in its clarity. These weren't wild demands for luxury, they were basic human rights. Yet CDCR initially dismissed the strike, calling it a gang power play and accusing leaders of manipulating others. Still, the momentum could not be ignored. Media outlets from the New York Times to the Los Angeles Times began reporting on the protests, describing the SHU in stark detail for the first time to mainstream audiences. Families of prisoners rallied at the state capitol in Sacramento, holding signs that read, "Solitary is torture," and "Our loved ones are human." The 2011 strike lasted 3 weeks before many participants ended their fast, weakened by extreme weight loss and medical risks. But the message had been delivered. Pelican Bay's SHU was no longer invisible. For the first time in decades, the conditions of long-term solitary confinement were on the front page of national newspapers. 2 years later, in July 2013, the men inside tried again, this time on a larger scale. The second hunger strike spread to 30,000 prisoners across California at its peak. It dwarfed the 2011 protest and became the largest hunger strike in California's prison history. The strike lasted for 60 days, with some participants dropping 40 or 50 pounds. At least one man, 32-year-old Billy Sell, was found dead in his cell during the strike. Fellow prisoners insisted he had committed suicide after days of fasting, though CDCR disputed the circumstances. His death only fueled anger among advocates on the outside. The strike drew international attention. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture repeated his call for an end to indefinite solitary confinement, warning that California's policies violated basic human rights. Amnesty International published a blistering report titled "The Edge of Endurance," documenting prisoners who had spent decades in tiny cells. State lawmakers were forced to hold hearings. Relatives of SHU prisoners testified, describing phone calls filled with despair, letters written in tiny handwriting to save paper, and visits conducted through thick glass with no physical contact. CDCR eventually made small concessions, promising to review gang validation procedures and to expand the step-down program. But prisoners and advocates saw these as half measures. The core problem remained. Thousands of men were still being held indefinitely in conditions that many described as psychological torture. The hunger strikes changed the debate. Before 2011, solitary confinement was a hidden practice, known mostly to prison experts and lawyers. After 2013, it was a matter of public controversy. Lawmakers, journalists, and civil rights groups began treating Pelican Bay's SHU as a symbol of a broken system. The strikes also laid the groundwork for the Ashker lawsuit by proving that prisoners could organize collectively, even under the crushing weight of isolation. When the dust settled, CDCR's credibility was damaged. The department had painted the hunger strikes as gang manipulation, but the broad participation across races and prisons undermined that claim. Men from rival groups, Black, Latino, and white prisoners, joined in solidarity, something rarely seen in California's racially segregated prison culture. For many on the outside, that unity gave the strikes moral force. It was no longer just about gangs, it was about human rights. By 2014, the Ashker lawsuit was moving forward in federal court, backed by the momentum of these hunger strikes. The strikes had given prisoners a voice, and the lawsuit promised to give that voice legal power. Together, they became the twin engines of reform, one inside the courts, the other inside the cells. By 2014, Ashker v. Brown was gaining traction in federal court. The plaintiffs, backed by the Center for Constitutional Rights and legal advocates, argued that California's policy of holding prisoners in indefinite solitary confinement without meaningful review violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment and the 14th Amendment's due process protections. The state countered that solitary was necessary to control gang violence, pointing to murders and assaults allegedly ordered from inside prison walls. But the judge, Claudia Wilkin, recognized the unique scale of California's isolation system. Unlike short-term segregation used elsewhere, California had created a de facto permanent shadow prison, where hundreds of men spent decades without sunlight or human contact. Facing the risk of a trial that could expose decades of practices, California officials agreed to negotiate. In September 2015, the Ashker settlement was announced. Indefinite solitary based solely on gang validation would end. Caps were placed on how long someone could remain in the SHU. Meaningful reviews and a step-down program were introduced. Thousands of men were released from the SHU to general population. It was one of the most significant solitary confinement reforms in U.S. history. The Ashker settlement didn't end solitary confinement, but it changed its future. For the first time, California admitted that decades in a concrete box was wrong. From Pelican Bay's silence came a voice that forced reform and proved that even behind steel doors, change is possible.